One of the most recognized relics associated with the legends of King Arthur is the Holy Grail. Few artifacts in history have inspired more speculation in literature than the mysterious Grail. For the modern Western individual, its mention typically calls up an image of the mysterious chalice that Christ drinks from at the Last Supper, thanks to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But it didn't take this form until Robert de Boron, a Burgundian knight, thought to have written Joseph of Arimathea around 1200, introduced the Holy Grail as the chalice of the Eucharist, given by Pontius Pilate to Joseph of Arimathea, that the relic took the form we now think of. Long before it was a chalice, it was first a platter, a dish of plenty. As best we can tell, its original inspiration comes from Celtic myth and arrives in the medieval mind through Chrétien de Troyes, who, drawing from some source shrouded in mystery, writes Percival, the story of the Grail. The word grail comes from the Old French graal, which means a cup or bowl of earth, wood, or metal. Its etymology before the Old French is unclear, with possible roots in the Latin words gradalis or gradale, referring to a deep platter used to serve food at medieval banquets. It may also come from the Latin word krator or kratus, borrowed from the ancient Greek word krater, meaning a large wine-mixing vessel. One of the difficulties with the Arthurian legends is that there is no definitive source from which the stories are pulled. They come from many authors across many ages. Sometimes the stories they tell map nicely onto each other, and in other cases, as with the stories of Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach, they depart from each other. For most English folk, Arthur's roots go back to Geoffrey Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain, 12th century, and the French writer Chrétien de Troyes. Chrétien's tale follows Percival, a young boy raised in the isolated forests of northwest Wales, brought there by a mother who wished to shelter him from the world of knighthood and the perils of chivalry. But an encounter with knights traveling through the town convinces Percival that his life's mission is to become a knight. So begins the adventure of Percival the Grail Knight. It is an adventure that sees Percival, a knight of destiny, come of age. In the tale, we watch as Percival progresses through maturity, evolving from an innocent and naive boy to a mature and seasoned warrior seeking the Holy Grail, though there are many detours along the way. His quest brings him to the castle of the Fisher King, a man tasked with guarding the Grail, bearing a wound on his thigh that renders him lame and impotent, and his kingdom barren. The Fisher King offers Percival hospitality in the mysterious Grail castle, and it is here that we drop into a dinner scene where we are first introduced to the Grail. Quote, "They sat in a hall lit as brightly as candles can make an indoor room. And as they chatted of this and that, a servant entered the hall, carrying his hand at the center a white lance. He came out of a room, then walked between the fire and those seated on the bed, and everyone saw the white wood and the white spearhead, and the drop of blood that rolled slowly down from the iron point until it reached the servant's hand. The boy saw that wondrous sight the night he arrived there, but he kept himself from asking what it might mean, for he'd never forgotten, as his master-at-arms had warned him over and over, that he was not to talk too much. To question his hosts or his servants might well be vulgar or rude, and so he held his tongue. And then 2 other servants entered, carrying golden candle holders worked with enamel. They were wonderfully handsome boys, and the candle holders they clasped in their hands bore at least 10 burning candles. A girl entered with them, holding a grail dish in both her hands. Beautiful girl, elegant, extremely well dressed. And as she walked into the hall holding this grail, it glowed with so great a light that the candles suddenly seemed to grow dim, like the moon and stars when the sun appears in the sky. Then another girl followed the first one, bearing a silver platter. The grail that led the procession was made of the purest gold, studded with jewels of every kind, the richest and most costly found on land or sea. No one could doubt that here were the loveliest jewels on earth. But as they had done before when carrying the lance, the servants passed in front of the knight, then went to another room. And the boy watched them, not daring to ask why or to whom the grail was meant to be served. What we and Percival learned later from the weeping woman is that had Percival asked the question, "Whom does it serve?" then the Fisher King would have been completely cured of all his wounds. Quote, "He would have become entirely whole and ruled as he should. How much good you'd have done." End quote. Percival's failure to ask the question, whom does it serve, comes with disastrous consequences, illustrating how the question you fear to ask is often a redeeming question. This, of course, raises the question, why would asking to whom does it serve heal the Fisher King? We, and Percival, later learned from the hermit that the Grail serves as a single life-sustaining wafer to the Fisher King's father, the Grail King. But this still doesn't answer the question of why Percival's question would heal. And we never are told in the tale. In fact, after this episode, most of the remaining half of Chrétien's work centers around the adventures of Gawain, as Percival passes largely out of view. The only other glimpse of Percival in the back half of the poem comes when the young knight resurfaces, after 5 long years of questing for answers to his questions about the Grail and whom it serves. It is a period, we're told, where Percival had so completely lost his memory that he forgets God and never once goes into a church. Percival, no longer a young boy, but now something like a broken man, comes to a group of Christians leaving the holy place of a hermit. Looking at Percival in his armor, they inform him he ought to take off his armor, for it is Good Friday, the day where Christians honor the cross and confess their sins, as they had done at the holy hermit's dwelling. Quote, hearing those words, Percival wept, and he wanted to speak with the holy hermit himself. End quote. Going to the hermit, Percival drops to his knees the moment he enters the chapel. The hermit sees his honest tears and calls him to confess. Percival, eager to come clean, reveals to the hermit how he failed to ask the magic question when he saw the lance and Grail, and for his failure the world suffered. The hermit, hearing Percival, reveals that the Grail served the Fisher King's father, as mentioned above, and then gives Percival his penance. Go to church first thing each morning, love God, honor good men and women, and if anyone asks for help, give it and help yourself. Tell me, the hermit asked Percival, is your heart willing? Entirely willing, answers Percival, as the two move into 2 days of fasting, praying, and repenting together. And then we get the last words from Detois on Percival before the night passes back into obscurity, his mystery growing with the Grails. Quote, and Percival learned once again that our Lord had died that Friday, crucified high on the cross. He made his Easter communion humbly in perfect simplicity. And here the story breaks away from Percival, about whom the tale turns silent. I'll speak a good deal of Gawain before Percival is mentioned again, end quote. Percival is, in fact, never mentioned again after this point. For this reason, among others, many scholars believe Chrétien left his tale unfinished, dying before he was able to work Percival back into the tale and bring the Grail story and its questions to resolution. But what one is left to wonder is whether Percival found the Grail, or at least something as good, after all. Many of the great religious teachers speak of an emptying of self that must come before transcendence. Christian theology has the idea of kenosis, self-emptying, and Eastern religions speak of sunyata, emptiness. And it is this state that Percival finds himself when he responds to the hermit's question of whether he's willing with, entirely willing. It is this state and stance of complete service to the world that paradoxically is the key to self-actualization. It's enough to make us wonder, perhaps the purpose of the Grail and Percival is how it reminds us with its question, to whom does it serve, of what question we ought to be asking. Whom do our actions serve? And perhaps our grasping of the Grail, the dish capable of healing king and kingdom, depends on we are willing to ask that same question. Part of the mystery of the Grail starts with Detois because of the story's title, Percival, the story of the Grail. With such a title, we expect the story to tell us much more about the Grail than it actually does. But what we find in the story is very little of the Grail. And what little we do see is very different than the Grail that the modern mind expects to find. In Percival, the Grail is a serving dish of plenty, not a chalice like the one seen in Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. That association comes from Robert de Boron, a Burgundian knight in his Joseph of Arimathea. The Grail takes another form in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, 13th century. In von Eschenbach's story, the Grail is described as a stone that fell from the heavens with strong links to the philosopher's stone in alchemy, the container of light-dark unity often identified with the Roman messenger god and guide of souls, Mercury. Then there's the quest of the Holy Grail, or La Quest del Saint Graal, the Quest for short, written in Old French by an anonymous author around 1210, which changes not only the form of the Grail, but introduces a new knight, Galahad, as the chief seeker. In the Quest, the Grail becomes a symbol of God, who reveals himself only to the one who is pure in heart and deed, the one who rejects the ways of the world and shows faith, humility, mercy, and purity. As in Detois' Percival, the Grail appears during an evening feast, though this time to King Arthur and his knights, including Galahad. Here's the scene. Taking their seats silently, a great and marvelous peal of thunder crashed from the clouds and shook the castle. Then shone a ray of sunshine, which made the palace sevenfold brighter than it was before. Dumbstruck, the knights were speechless when suddenly the Grail entered, covered by a white cloth, though none could see who carried it. Its presence was accompanied by a sweet odor, as if all the spices of the earth were diffused from it. It moved around the table to serve the knights, and once all were served to their specific needs and desires, the Holy Grail was gone as quickly as it had appeared, none among them seeing which way it went. Standing from his seat, Gawain declares a vow to enter the quest. I will not return until I have seen it more clearly than it has been manifested to me here. Even peradventure it be destined that I can behold it. Hearing Gawain, the rest of the knights make the same vow. They would not cease from their wandering until they should sit at the high table where such sweet meat was daily served as that which they had just tasted. Glad yet sorrowful, Arthur and his ladies of the kingdom lamented what this meant. Important and noble as it was, many would lose their lives on this quest. As the knights made their preparations, a worthy man announced what the quest was all about. This quest is not a quest for earthly things, but it is a search for the deep secrets and confidences of our Lord, and for the great mysteries which the High Master will show openly to that fortunate knight whom he has elected among all of the other knights of earth to be his servant. To him he will reveal the great marvel of the Holy Grail, and will show him what mortal heart could not conceive, nor the tongue of earthly man utter. End scene. In all its various forms and appearances, the Grail symbolizes the fully realized self, the container of divine life accessible only to the pure. To see the Grail is to see God face to face. It is to witness the otherwise invisible yet infinite energy of creation, with the power to sustain eternally and turn death to life at work in the world. While the knights engage in an outward quest for a physical object, there is an inward quest towards self-knowledge and transformation that runs parallel. The Grail journey also tests the pursuing knight's ability to empty themselves of ego and submit themselves entirely and often at great cost to service. In this emptying, we watch as the knights become vessels capable of allowing the divine and its will to pass through them unimpeded. For those successful, we watch them become the Grail that returns vitality to a wasteland, and for those who fail, like Lancelot or Gawain, we get a cautionary tale of how becoming a slave to the flesh disqualifies one from the prize. Also embedded in the story of the Grail is the idea that the knights must enter the forest where there is no path. The knight must be willing to strike out on their own and find their own way. Writer and mythologist Joseph Campbell loved this image as a metaphor for choosing one's life work. Keeping the Grail as a symbol of the self in mind, we see the lesson. If you go where there's a path, then you're on someone else's, and yours, the only one you can take, is left untrodden. Nobody ever reached their potential by taking the paths meant for others. The message, Campbell writes, is that if you follow a trail or path, you're following someone else's adventure, not your own. Every human being is unique and must find his or her adventure by entering the forest where there is no way or path. End quote. Not only must the knights go where there is no path, they must also enter where it's darkest and thickest to them, again expressing the individual nature of the quest, as it's implied that the forest is dark at different places for each of the knights. We see a key component of Jung's individuation process here. The key to our development sits at the center of our fear. What we need most waits where we least want to look. In the case of King Arthur and his knights, the dark forest is the obstacle and the fear, which is why it points the way to the Holy Grail, a more actualized and magnanimous self. For the medieval knight, the mission was simple: abandon self-interest and find the Holy Grail to revive both king and kingdom. Symbolically, we might say the mission was to abandon the self, world desires and delights, to find the capital S self, defined as the organizing center and totality of the psyche, containing all potential and the God within. The reward for the one who completed the quest and obtained the Grail? Eternal abundance, bliss, and union with God, like when Galahad is taken to heaven, along with the Grail. Despite the Grail's grand promise, only a few complete it. Because the cost is high, it requires the complete abandonment of self-interest and consistent delay of short-term gratification. Everybody wants the Grail. Nobody wants to take the path for as long as is required, because the road is dark and lonely. It requires that the one traveling endlessly go where they least want to and withstand, time and again, the alluring temptations of world glory and goods. It takes total emptiness of ego and subordination to a higher and greater cause. It demands that the traveler constantly set aside their self-interest and reorient their direction based on the North Star, which is the Grail question. What is the highest service I can bring to my fellow human beings and the earth? That question is our question, and their charge is our charge. What is the highest way we can use our unique gifts to serve others? What would it look like to devote our days to spending ourselves in that worthy cause? How might we have the courage to enter the forests of our life where it is darkest and there is no path? In asking these questions and then acting on the answers, we embark on our own Grail quest. But instead of chasing a chalice or a serving platter, we seek a realized self and make ourselves into a sort of Grail. A container of the divine capable of delivering a life-giving elixir that revitalizes the wasteland. As we pursue our individual quests, we become role models and beacons for all. The awakened individual awakens the community, which awakens the world. The little lamp of a solitary soul coming alive sparks 1,000 embers into a sea of flames. A world in peril becomes a world redeemed, but only if we are brave enough to complete the quest.